So I just realized when I recorded the last one, the entire one, I was using the wrong microphone. This is The Last Coffee House. This particular episode, we are talking about, and we changed locations too, because I thought the location was the problem, but my god. So now we're in this PandaCon in front of me. Got my favorite quote from On the Road in front of me, a Shakespeare calendar. And we're talking about the March for Our Lives now. This march happened in D.C. just a few days ago. I think it was this weekend. And it was specifically about, it's about gun control. It's in response to the Parkland shooting. But it's incredibly vague. And that's been kind of a standard modus operandi of recent movements. Whether it's BLM or the Women's March or now the March for Our Lives, they're incredibly vague. They generally don't ask for much of anything in particular. They just say things like, we want less gun deaths. Oh, okay, yes. I don't know how many people out there want more gun deaths, but so just to start with and we'll go through, the same analysis, but just to start with the March for Our Lives, that's what it's called. March for Our Lives. How vague could it possibly be? The March for Our Lives. Now, there are many more numerically important causes of death out there. Heart disease, cancer, etc., etc. And the actual impact, the substantive impact of mass shootings and especially school shootings is infinitesimal when proportionally compared to the other causes of death and the other causes of death by gun. I mean, suicide should be just, when it comes to gun violence, suicide should be like the number one concern when it comes to what we could do to save lives related to gun violence. Now, of course, there are, and we'll get into this when we talk about the structure, there are millions of factors that go into this when it comes to determining which is more important, but I digress a bit. So they always talk about I've heard this so many times already. We just want something done. Just something done related to guns. Get some kind of legislation. I think the quote that was used in this particular rally, tighter controls on guns. Okay, so which controls? So what laws would be implemented to create those controls? Would it just be states or federal? What empirical data supports each proposed measure that demonstrates that it would be useful to improving this stuff, to fixing the gun violence, etc. Then you have to ask, okay, which side of the debate is likely to, so insofar as it is reducible to two sides, because obviously nobody is for more gun violence. There's nobody out there saying, yeah, let's increase it. Let's preserve it. Everybody wants to get rid of gun violence. They just have very different ideas about where gun violence comes from and how you want to respond to it. So which side has a greater degree of bias when it comes to this particular question? Of course, in this particular case, I would think that the people who suffered something that was absolutely horrendous and heart-wrenching and emotionally, they're in the midst of an emotional upheaval because they were thrust into something that was absolutely horrible. That likely increases their bias disproportionately to the bias that, like, say, Republicans or a gun lobby would have in wanting to keep their guns or get more money, get more donors if you're the NRA or whatever else, and maintain your political power. The bias, I would think, is heavily weighted on the side that has an emotional reaction to it, and it's going to make it less likely they can be objective about it, but that's not to discount all of the bias on the other side as well, even if it's just kind of an irrational need to expand and not just protect, but have the most expansive definition of the Second Amendment they can possibly muster. That's bias as well, but it's not likely going to be to the degree that the bias that we're talking about when you've been involved in something that's as horrible as anybody can imagine. It's not likely going to create that kind of a bias. Okay, so, we can talk about specific kind of responses. So one that I've heard bandied about is banning AR-15 semi-automatic rifles. So it seems like a straightforward thing. We've got at least two in recent memory that were very deadly that used AR-15s, and so why not just ban them altogether? So there are some intellectual problems with that, in that if you apply the same logic to this to other areas of inquiry or big questions, then you would get some very unsavory results. So from what I could find, there are some 15 million AR-15s out there in the United States. There's some 300 million guns in general, but 15 million. And I couldn't find very clear numbers. I didn't look all that hard to break it down, but it was getting difficult to kind of get clear numbers on gun ownership. But from what I could tell, around 8 million are privately owned, because I wanted to delineate between, government owned and government contracted and police owned, local police, etc., versus private ownership. And from what I could tell, about 8 million are privately owned. So it's somewhere between 8 and 15 million, AR-15s just out there. And technically you could include all those ones that the police have, that the military has, etc., if you want to talk about the numbers and how they're used and all that. But so there have only been a handful of shootings with AR-15s, while you have, 8 to 15 million of AR-15s out there on the streets. So the question is utility. So if you, not just utility, but just starting with that. So utility is like, you ban AR-15s, there are 8 to 15 million of them out there, and you're not necessarily hitting the people that you're looking for by just banning those. Of course, the vast majority of attacks are done without AR-15s. They're done with other kinds of guns and other kinds of weapons. But when it comes to guns, other kinds of guns. But more importantly, and the thing that if you extrapolate this out into other kinds of aspects of inquiry, then if you look at 8 million private owners, 7,999,998 of them, don't improperly use their AR-15. So are you attacking a person's right? And I'm not talking about a constitutional right. We'll get into that. Are you attacking somebody's right and you're just way overdoing it? Because the vast, 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 vast majority of people who have AR-15s don't use them for illicit purposes. This would be like, because there's a certain level of people who speed, and speeding causes car accidents, which causes unnecessary deaths, that you make the permanent speed limit 15 miles per hour everywhere. If you make the speed limit 15 miles per hour everywhere, it's going to significantly impact, even more so proportionally, it's going to impact the kinds of deaths that you see. But what kind of an imposition are we putting on people, the vast, vast, vast majority of which are not abusing that right? So in this particular case, it's a tiny fraction of the AR-15s that are out there are used for the wrong purposes. Now, get into my personal bias. I personally would be perfectly fine with banning all AR-15s. I don't think anybody needs an AR-15. Obviously, people would differ with me on that. Some people would say it's an excellent gun and it's great for hunting. It's not necessary for hunting, but it's great for it because it handles really well. It's really reliable. It's just the best way to do it. In addition to that, a lot of the people, and it's not necessarily completely irrational or anything like that, but a number of people see gun ownership as a check on tyranny. I think it sounds ridiculous. If the government wants to roll in with a tank, and start shooting howitzers at you, it's just, what is your AR-15 really going to do? I mean, if you have mortars and everything else, you're still not going to be able to do all that well against the government if they want to come take something from you. But, we're just screwed if the military goes along with it, just the way it is. However, it's certainly some kind of a point to say that it's a kind of rifle that would at least make local government question their inclination to be tyrannical, but it also could be more dangerous if they have to exercise their proper authority. So I mean that one's, who knows. So getting to the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment. Now I had to read the Second Amendment cases when I was in law school. I don't remember them all that well. I just remember that Scalia, may he rest in peace. I did not like the guy, but may he rest in peace. He in Heller, I know he wrote the opinion for Heller, and he decided that the well-regulated militia portion of the clause was not related to the gun ownership portion of the clause, so they're independent, and you have a right, based on the Second Amendment, to have a handgun in the home for self-defense. That's what kind of the threshold of the Second Amendment. That's what can't be infringed upon. This was expanded upon by, what was it? I think it was Chicago. It's an Illinois case. But anyway, it was expanded upon a little bit in that they included, the Supreme Court included other handheld implements. In this case, it was a taser. It was a taser that a woman had, and she was citing the Second Amendment right to have that taser because it was taken away from her. The argument was, and the lower courts agreed, that this kind of a thing, this implement, was not even thought of at the time, so therefore it could not fit within the Second Amendment. The Supreme Court disagreed and overturned, said that yes, even modern weapons can fit within this idea of arms that you can bear. Hopefully that's used. They use this whole idea of arms that are bearable, so people can't have, just nuclear weapons and the like. Although, I think I remember in Fallout, wasn't it Fallout, you could have a handheld nuke? But, obviously we should structure all of our Second Amendment jurisprudence around Fallout. I think that would be a smart way to do it. But so the Second Amendment protects your right to not even have a handgun outside of the home. I'm sure the Supreme Court would say that you have a right to transport it from a place to your home, the place of purchase to your home. You have to buy all your handguns via Amazon or something. But that's what the Second Amendment protects. So, of course, the NRA and gun rights advocates, they'd want to expand that and say, no, well, it also includes AR-15s and et cetera, et cetera. Anybody else who respects the Constitution, they would say that no, it's a handgun in the home for protection. So if you want even a handgun for hunting, you can't do that. That's beyond the scope of what the Second Amendment intended. So that's what the Second Amendment is at. And I'm no expert on the Second Amendment. My area of the law is civil rights, but it's not Second Amendment jurisprudence. So just moving on to some of the quotes that we have from here. So one of them says, "We will get rid of these public servants who only care about the gun lobby." Okay, I really think that so much of what activists have to say, especially nowadays, oh God, I miss the old days when people were like posing things like the Iraq War. It's like okay, at least people had some concrete grievances related to this. Now it's, we will get rid of these public servants who only care about the gun lobby. It feels so much more like people just they're trying to assert themselves when you've got this power vacuum related to decline in religion and all of that. This is a huge topic that we just cannot talk about right now, but I really think that the kind of rhetoric that you see in here, it's really not about establishing some true propositions and establishing things that are actually going to be helpful and useful. It's about the act of speaking and the act of being an activist as opposed to accomplishing something, using activism to accomplish something. And this is one of those things. It's an assertion of their authority, their 17, 18-year-old authority, that they're going to oust public figures who don't fall in line, who only, quote, only care about the gun lobby. Of course, there are many a politician who receive some kind of funding from the NRA, just as so many other narrow interests support politicians, and those politicians have to weigh those interests against doing whatever else. I don't say the right thing, because who the hell knows what the right thing is, but that's just simply always the case. Oh, one thing, so I'm into the quotes, but I wanted to talk about, there was an assault weapons ban that I think it was in the 90s. Was it Clinton who started it? But it went until 2004, and then it lapsed and wasn't renewed. Then under Obama, I know, and people simplistically talk about this stuff, like they say Obama did this, but there was a bill introduced in 2013, I believe, that was another assault weapons ban, but it was defeated in the Senate. I think it didn't get through the Senate. But anyway, so there was one on the books that subsequently left. Anybody who's familiar with kind of crime statistics in the 90s might want to cite that as contributory to it. Let's say the crime statistics, but very few crimes are actually done with assault weapons. And of course I would, and we might get to this topic at some point, but I would attribute most of the crime decrease to Roe v. Wade, actually. And anybody who's read Freakonomics or seen that as a meme somewhere. And I'm going to use the word meme as was originally intended, but also in the other way, like the funny way. So meme, coined by Richard Dawkins to talk about how it's like a gene, but it's for ideas. So hopefully kids nowadays, they can understand that's where it came from. It's not about just funny pictures or weird. My favorite one actually is Super High. I don't know if anybody's seen these videos. They crack me up. It's dank memes. It's the kind that make no freaking sense. And and just are extremely loud and obnoxious and offensive, and they crack me up to no end. But anyway, what was it? So memes, like I was saying, these are like genes, but they're ideas that get passed around from person to person. And I can't remember why I brought that up. But anyway, so the other quotes, they say, quote, "We say no more," unquote. Okay, so nobody says, I mean, maybe they mean no more lack of regulation, but if they say no more gun violence, which is what a lot of the signs I saw said, just no more gun violence, it's like nobody's advocating for gun violence. At least have the integrity to attack your opponent's position as opposed to just say truisms. It's like a tautological conversation where people are just, I hate gun violence, I also hate gun violence, you're so wrong because I hate gun violence, and stop being a dick, and I hate gun violence too. And it's like, right? Yeah, nobody's for, nobody wants more gun violence. So then, gosh, I can't stand this kid stuff. When they bring up kids and try to use children, it's already annoying freaking enough that all these kids think, because I remember this, I was a kid at some point when I was going through undergrad. I thought I knew everything about everything. I was a complete genius and figured the entire world out, and if people would just give me the reins to all of the institutions, then I could fix everything. And that's what all of those damn kids think until they get out into the real world. But now we are handing the keys of the kingdom over to the children, and it's nonsense. They don't have the intelligence or the information or anything else to be able to make determinations on these things. And these kids in particular, they just went through a traumatic event. You think that's going to make them more rational? That's why they don't have any ideas. They don't have any understanding. They don't have anything to contribute in any meaningful way. It's just media on either side trying to get points around this particular issue. Nobody's trying to actually accomplish anything. It drives me freaking crazy. But anyway, so MLK's granddaughter, I think she's like 9 years old. His granddaughter, I didn't do the math on that, but I think it said 9-year-old granddaughter. I don't know. But she said, this should be a gun-free world, period. A gun-free world. Why didn't we think of that? God, why haven't we tried that one yet? Just remove all of the guns from everywhere in the world. I think they tried that on Family Guy in one of the episodes. They were all throwing all their guns. It was a post-apocalypse, and they threw all their guns onto the fire heap, and they're, okay, every last gun, that was the last one, and they're gone. And then all the mutant Stewies came and attacked everybody, and they're like, oh, I wish we hadn't destroyed all of our guns. This isn't the kind of thing that contributes to a better understanding or a better conversation about gun violence. This isn't even close. I mean, it's arguable whether we should be even having a conversation about gun violence. Is it really about that? There are so many goddamn guns out there, and yet gun violence is minuscule proportionally to the amount of guns that are out there. So is it really about gun violence? And we'll talk about my biases and however those might be impacting whatever I'm talking about. But MLK's granddaughter, this should be a gun-free world. Oh, like, how complex is that idea? How crazy? Just, okay, there are how many guns in every country in the world, and now we're gonna go out and disarm all of them and destroy all of those guns. Come on, can we talk like adults, please? Another quote, there was so much more that could have been done to prevent this. I want to see change, unquote. And this, again, incredibly vague. What could have been done? What would have prevented it? And what would prevent the next one? If it was, from what I understand, and I haven't gone deeply into all the ins and outs of this, but, the principle still stands that this is an incredibly complex area, and this is something that people do all the time, especially in these kinds of big questions, is that they'll latch on to any given, datum. It's like, I have 3 statistics, and that's supposed to be sufficient for me to understand this entire area of inquiry. When in reality, you need to be conceptually and concurrently understanding about 1 million different pieces of information to really have a handle on what should be done in this area. So that drives me crazy. So this there was so much more that could have been done to prevent this. Now, so what? The people in the FBI doing their jobs, local law enforcement doing their jobs. Yeah, these are individuals in particular situations that are going to work on a daily basis, that have a certain amount of training and a certain amount of intelligence and a certain amount of attention and ability and capacity and all this stuff. All of these things together, and we don't know at what point in the chain of events we needed to pluck out something or input something that would have sent it the other direction to prevent this. We also don't know how many were prevented apart from this one, that worked, and how all of that would interplay. Like if you change this, would it have let another thing out? We don't know any of that, and they don't offer any of that kind of analysis. They simply say, there was something, I want to see something change, just change something. And quite obviously, simply banning AR-15 doesn't mean they would disappear tomorrow. There would still be 15 million of them out there. There would still be other kinds of guns that are sold all over the place. There would still be illegal gun trades and sales and personal owners and all sorts of other stuff. And in this particular case, I mean, there were many, many warning signs related to, and of course, this is kind of the balances. Was it about his psychological and mental disability, or was it about the guns? And none of these kids are talking about these disabilities, and they're all talking about guns and guns and doing stuff about guns. I really, this is a big question. There are 300 million guns out there. There are, millions of owners who, for various reasons, don't engage in any kind of illicit activity with those guns. So what do you, are you putting all those pieces together to determine, okay, this is the weight of the evidence that suggests that this particular legislative action would do the thing that we're trying to establish? No, you're not doing that. You're saying a bunch of stuff. I'm sure so much of this was just force-fed by people with agendas related to the Democratic Party or whatever else, and it's disheartening is really what it is. So then they talk about in the article, they talk about percentages, like something like 69% in the United States think gun laws should be tightened. Okay, how incredibly vague are you going to be? Just should be tightened in general? If I got that in a survey, I'd say, yeah, sure, I think they should be tightened. It's like, just more background checks? Make sure that people who have mental disabilities don't get guns? I'd be okay with that. But it's just gun laws should be tightened. All right, it's incredibly vague, but that... whatever. So Florida State, because states have substantial autonomy when it comes to, the area between the Second Amendment and just freely letting any kind of armament that a person wants, because there's no federal law related to it. The Florida raised the age to buy assault rifles. They raised it from 18 to 21, I think. I know Trump was initially stating that he would be interested in doing that and then backed away from it. So good on Florida, fine. Again, I mean, what kind of impact is this going to make? How many 18 to 21 year olds, less than, not inclusive of 21, how many of them were buying assault rifles? How many of the people in that age range bought assault rifles and used them for illicit purposes? Legally purchased the assault rifle. If it's just one, then what kind of step is this? If it wasn't even the one, I can't remember all the details, but if it wasn't even the one, or if it was just one, then is this really accomplishing anything? Is this just a token kind of an effort just to appease people who have an emotional reaction to something that happened? So finally, the important understanding here is that gun control measures should be a good idea all the time, not merely when they are temporally close to a powerful emotional trigger. You should be able to say, even when there hasn't been a shooting in a while, you should be able to say that this gun measure is a good measure. Even if there's nothing in the papers about this horrible thing that happened, you should be able to say that this makes perfect logical sense, this fits within everything that we're trying to accomplish, and there's empirical data that shows that this will accomplish that. That's what we should be looking at. All right, going into my limitations, obviously there are, the question here is, it's kind of a mix of questions, because it's how would you prevent further shootings? Should the AR-15 be banned? Is the March for Our Lives have any validity whatsoever? And my limitations in this area, obviously, the weight is going to be heavy because there are millions of parts to this that have to do with individual gun owners, individual psychology, abnormal psychology, what percentage of guns are used for illicit purposes, what percentage of those guns used for illicit purposes are AR-15s, what percentage of AR-15s are not used for illicit purposes, what kind of creep should we allow on persons' rights when it doesn't have a distinct value to the polity. And that's one thing you'll see in constitutional law, that there are certain levels that there's a rational basis, there's it's been a while since I took constitutional law. There are like 4 different ones for different contexts. When the government is trying to infringe upon somebody's right, there has to be a very good reason for the government to do this. And so if encroaching upon what people might perceive as something under the Second Amendment, it would have to have extremely heavy utility. There would have to be a very good interest of the government to be able to ban this for them to go in and do that. Of course, I established that under the Second Amendment, it doesn't seem like the cases support any kind of a right to an AR-15. It just supports a right to a handgun in the home for self-protection. That's what it supports. That's what it protects. And I'm okay with the Second Amendment doing that. But in talking about my limitations, so there are many moving parts. I've had guns pulled on me, but I haven't been involved in any kind of major shootings. I know a shooting happened close to us very recently, actually. In that particular case, from what I understand, actually there was a police officer that was near at the time the shooting started, and the police officer actually shot the shooter. So there wasn't much play from certain sides of the media. There wasn't much play to that. But anyway, so I don't own a gun. I don't have any particular interest in guns. I would personally be fine with banning AR-15s altogether, but there could be a million things that I'm not looking at. So the anchor in this particular case, of course, it's weighted based on the number of elements beyond 7 plus or minus 2, and there are millions of elements related to this. Like I said, it's human psychology, it's abnormal psychology, it's all of the biological and sociological things that lead a given person with a certain range of psychological inclinations and disinclinations to have access to a gun, to use the gun, well, in a way that causes a lot of damage, to create an atmosphere in a particular school where it doesn't have any kind of extra protection. I know Trump said something about arming teachers, which I'm not particularly inclined to have a bunch of pistols or otherwise around a whole bunch of children all the time. I really don't think that will balance out related to the mass shootings that we've had to deal with. Not only that, but the cost just personally to any given teacher who has to now be involved in the vocation of protecting with force, using firearms, protecting their children or whatever else. It's like, how can we demand that of teachers? And obviously the cost of it, of purchasing a gun for every teacher in the country, or demanding that they be willing to leap into the fray and risk certain death or severe injury to be able to stop this kind of a thing. And I mean, all those things just all together. I certainly wouldn't want them unprotected, but the whole question is, okay, what's effective? How do we approach this question in a way that we understand our own limitations and our own biases, and that we put the proper weight to the Socratic anchor that is going to establish that I need to have a heaping ton of humility when it comes to making some determination off the cuff related to this kind of a complex issue. Now, so the anchor is going to be pretty heavy given all the elements in here. My biases, I listen to Sam Harris on a pretty regular basis, and he started off, he was pretty anti-gun, and then he got into self-defense and all that stuff. And he had a couple people on who talked about guns, and he advocates having a gun in the home and properly being trained and storing it and all that stuff. And I like Sam Harris quite a bit, so that could be biasing me in some way. Like I explained, I think in the last episode, I've only voted liberal in any presidential election. So historically, when I was in undergrad especially, all my teachers were liberal, my professors, except for maybe one. So I already had that skewed perspective where I wanted to get rid of guns. I thought it was absurd that people thought that they would be able to protect themselves from government tyranny with a gun. I still relatively think that's pretty absurd. But, I respect every amendment pretty much equally. I mean, the right to free speech, I think, is just the most important thing in the freaking history of the world. But the Second Amendment is the Second Amendment. It's there. I did think, contra Scalia, that the militia part of the clause is attached to the other part and that was a conditional. But given that the Supreme Court has found otherwise, I respect that determination and the definition that was given. I think it's perfectly reasonable to give people the legal right, the constitutional right to say that they can own a gun for self-protection purposes in the home. I think that's perfectly reasonable, and it's aligned with our Constitution in the way that it's been interpreted, and I'm okay with that interpretation. So it's kind of a balanced bias, and obviously, I'm not taking in everything into account. This is a method to understand how we should be coming to making decisions. That's what we're trying to do here. Not making an absolute determination on any given proposition. But all of these things come into account. I mean, I had a certain diet today that could be affecting the way that I'm making a determination on this particular idea. It's a particular day of the week. It's a Sunday and I have to go to work tomorrow. So that could be affecting my ability to analyze or look at this in an objective way. And especially given the limitations that there are so many moving parts, it's very difficult, and there's no way that anybody should be saying, yes, I'm sure that this is the proper way to handle this particular situation. That's absolutely ridiculous. So given all those things together, I think just taking kind of one of the questions that we were looking at is whether the March for Our Lives, whether it's valid, whether it has importance, or it's establishing, important answers to important questions, and I don't think so. I think it's vacuous, a completely vacuous political theater that doesn't have any kind of actual validity or value when it comes to determining what's actually the correct thing to do. I'm really kind of appalled and dismayed that we're trying to, there's so many things that are wrong about this. It's just like in saying that by virtue of the fact of having been involved in a tragedy, that you have some kind of expertise in that tragedy. It's more honing in an identity and saying that the identity gives some kind of a special status. It's everything that has to do with BLM and things related to that, saying that all people of a certain identity are racist, or all people of a certain identity are magical experts in a particular race, or have to have some kind of a position related to racism and all that stuff. It's anything like that that's based on identity is the problem. Those are the things that we need to be avoiding, getting away from. Of course, I say all of this with the trenchant humility based on, all the biases, etc., that I have, and we'll go, I'm sure that'll come up at some point and I can get more deeply into that. But I think the whole concept of identity is incredibly problematic. And if you take even a minute to think about it, I think like I said in the last episode, if you take even a minute to think about it, what it actually means to say that you have an identity, then I think it'll fall by the wayside. You'll realize how vacuous it is. And in this particular case, I had my car broken into. That doesn't make me an expert on how to stop crime related to, property crime. It's one of those things where it's emotional high, ride the emotional, pay dirt, use it to get some kind of a benefit out of it, but you're not actually doing anything that's helping anything. You're not trying to get to a better answer to a difficult question. So I think it's just a waste. I don't think it accomplished anything. I saw some of the pictures from the signs, and they're just vacuous nonsense. And that's irrespective of any given gun controls that we do eventually implement. Hopefully they're effective if they're implemented, or if we don't need any because none of them are going to be useful, then we don't implement them and we still turn out fine because we do things better with mental health, or people do their jobs and the FBI doesn't drop the ball, So I don't know. Again, this is all in light of the Socratic anchor weighing down any of my confidence in a proposition that's complex, and anybody could challenge me or attack any of my premises or arguments, or argue that, I didn't properly weight my biases or anything like that. And that's perfectly fine. But in this particular case, the ultimate proposition that I've landed on is that the March for Our Lives was vacuous political theater. and it didn't accomplish anything of substance, and we need to stop pretending like children are some magical creatures by virtue of being young, and we need to start doing the real work of trying to figure out the answers to these big, important, difficult, complex questions. Thank you.